Well, congratulations, ladies, gentlemen, boys and girls. Not only have you lived through the five worst years of our helicopter recession, you've lasted through 2 days of back-to-back presentations and catering food that's suitable only for conferences. So hopefully you're full, you're happy, you are, I see most of you already doing your emails saying what a great speech Clark McGinn just gave, and I was proud to be there. I want to apologise slightly for my voice and assure people, particularly those friends from Hong Kong, that this has nothing to do with coronavirus. I didn't touch any corona last night. It was all Pilsner I drank. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, today is the feast of Ash Wednesday. And so what I'm going to do for the next half hour is call all you unrepentant sinners to pay and come and pay for your sins with Uncle Clark. We work in an asset-intensive industry, and there are two key parts to an asset-intensive industry. There's the asset itself, and then there's the money you can make from that asset. That is a very simple explanation. It works if you're an operator, if you're a banker, or if you're a lessor. And I know because I've been all three, and my friends do say I've still not succeeded in any of those three today. So I'm going to tell you what should have been done rather than what I actually did. Because if you pay for an asset with no income, you're not actually an investor, you're an art collector. Let's look at the good old days. For those of you old enough to remember, and I can see the old age pensioners are all down in front of me, so I'll speak very loudly for you guys, Gerald. In the good old days, the big operating companies were the ones who did the speculative orders. It was sort of half speculative, or sort of, I know what my customers are going to want over the next few years. They had that binary relationship with the OEMs. Typically, what would happen with a new asset, it would run in its primary role with a CHC or a Bristol or a PHI for maybe 8 years or 16 years or 24 years as a workhorse. Going out every day in the North Sea or Brazil or Australia, bringing men and women on and off the oil rigs. As it got older, it would probably slip from the big 7 oil companies to somebody in the middle. Then, of course, what would happen, whether it was at 16 years or 24 years, we'd move into the transition phase, and that was alluded to just in the previous section. Those transitions would typically be taking that aircraft out of the North Sea with a big oil major to either a secondary player or a secondary jurisdiction. And then after a period there, it would settle down into a tertiary role where it would get sold down the river for logging or lumber or quarantining coronavirus people in Hong Kong. That life ladder was a very important part of the decision that many people made to invest in the sector. The disastrous few years that we've experienced is because of a breakdown in that. And let me just take you through why the oversupply we face today occurred because of that breakdown in that historical life ladder. In retrospect, part of it is relatively easy. The OEMs, who are normally incredibly good at tight production, double counted the speculative order book. For income's milestone slaps a couple of $100 billion down on the table, or so it seemed at the time, doubles its order book, but at the same time, CHC, Bristol, PHI, Babcock have their order books running along saying we'll never need the lessors. Then add to that our friends in Petrobras, who in a moment of Copacabana wonderment said we can add another 40 heavies over the next 5 years as well, and so that got thrown into the production mix. That oversupply bubble was hidden. It wasn't noticed, and it was very much what Mike Platt called a max moment. That max moment for the helicopters was the first grounding of the H-225s. Nothing had happened like this before. We were all at a bit of a loss. And so the old held-for-sale helicopters that we were going to sell down the river to the logging companies or to Iceland for fishing or whatever were drawn back in, sucked back in to meet today's problem, which was getting the boys and girls off the rigs quickly because the H-225 was grounded for how long we don't know. That did two things. One, it kept those older assets working for the operators after the, in inverted commas, should have been in terms of the life limit. The second thing, which was something that Tony Cramp mentioned, was, of course, we showed the operator, the oil companies, there was a great inefficiency in the system of having that 1225 sitting there, going out in the morning, coming back in the evening, and doing nothing else for the rest of the week. But when the 225s came back, we're all sitting there, we've got these aircraft, and of course, we're now over $100 a barrel. The temptation to push those older pieces of equipment onto exploration and development was just too much of a sugar rush for people to avoid. So what we had was, whereas the big operators typically kept exploration and development to 10% plus or minus a wee bit of their book and 90% into production, all of a sudden, when the music stopped, or as Warren Buffett said, when the tide came out, we noticed who wasn't wearing swimming trunks. That oversupply was a problem, because now we couldn't shift the older equipment, and we had an oversupply of the new equipment, and the two things came together in that, what somebody called a double whammy earlier. If the normal positions had worked, we would have been still in a downturn, but not to the level of oversupply that we have today. So let's just hold that thought on the asset for a minute, and let's turn to the money. As Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, said when asked why he robbed banks, that's where the money is, stupid. So you should have a good plan for taking these very expensive assets and using them for a very long time with very respectable. I think Shell has just pulled the plug on me, actually. Long-term, mission-critical transactions were the purpose of the helicopter market, what brought in leasing companies and what brought in other investors, and even as Shell was saying, some of the partnerships that they did to fund startup operators to continue. But when the collapse came, both the international oil companies and the national oil companies firstly cancelled all exploration development. So all of those old kits that had been used for that were immediately grounded, and with no prospect of displacing an S92 or an AW139, with also no prospect of quickly moving that number of aircraft into tertiary roles or tertiary jurisdictions, particularly when you think that the oil collapse was global. You're not going to manage to shift those old things. So we faced two problems in terms of money. We had too many helicopters, and the amount of revenue that was coming per helicopter could be cut at the whim of the oil company. And the oil company, ladies and gentlemen, has a very, very big whim indeed. Again, that's a change from the old model. When I started with Royal Bank 15 years ago lending in the sector, renewal rates for oil company contracts were in the high, well, the mid 90%, it's 94, 95% of contracts would just be renewed because it was easier, it was efficient, there was no transaction rubbing, there was no frictional cost. Now, well, everything's up for grabs. And not just the contract rate. In inverted commas, the good old days, the oil company would have paid mobilization costs, would have paid levels of infrastructure, it may have paid for some pilot training and re-regulation. All of that now dumped on the operator. You've got to eat that too, boys. And so what we saw was, because of the oversupply, because of the bills needing to be paid to the lessor, what we saw was a race to the bottom. I think at least one company thought that another company was so weak financially it could be pushed out by even being more aggressively driving to the bottom. And all that happened, of course, was first CHC, my dear friends, went into Chapter 11, and then, of course, other people followed. Because once the lemmings had started pushing that pricing down, the momentum behind that downward push would drag everyone in. Ericsson, PHI, Bristol, a couple of the small guys. So did Chapter 11 solve the problem? Well, it solved the problem certainly for some of the advisors, whether they could have 2 holiday homes or 3 holiday homes. But did it solve the problems of our industry? I'm not quite as sure it did. Because remember, Chapter 11 is great for sorting out the balance sheet, or BS. It sorted out a lot of BS, did Chapter 11. But it didn't sort out the revenue question. So I hear the brighter people saying, surely somebody like CHC going in first would have a competitive advantage. For a small time it could have been. But the shock of people going bust, of large companies going bust, of critical companies going bust, only meant that the oil companies kept tightening terms more. And what we found, now that people have come back out of Chapter 11, that unless there is some consolidation, you quite simply have too many people chasing too few dollars. That, friends, is a really depressing prospect. Now, of course, it needn't be totally depressing, and Steve gave us some of the modest green shoots, lime green shoots that we're possibly seeing. And it was also, I think, very positive hearing Tony Cramp and we had Lloyd last year saying that they too are aware that this process has perhaps gone too far, that the juggernaut of price cutting has actually eviscerated the supply chain to an extent that one could imagine quite easily, not a mechanical fault in an aircraft, but just some poor engineer, some poor pilot, concerned and worried about his or her income. Will the company survive? They make, in that pressure, that financial pressure, an unfortunate mistake. That is a risk that should not be taken. So obviously, we knew when we started this business, this foray, that helicopters were a cyclical business. I remember my first due diligence visit up in Aberdeen. It wasn't Ali, he was safe away from there. But some wise old gentleman told me why it was called a cyclical industry. And he said, I started in the oil fields just after school, and I got on a push bike, and I went from home, went down to the airport, got in a helicopter and got off. I rose to middle management. I was doing quite well, got a couple of bonuses, bought myself a second-hand BMW. I could drive into the airport terminal. And when I became a big boss, in the boom years, the money was flowing into Aberdeen from Houston like water down a drain. And I bought myself a brand new top-of-the-range BMW. And then within 2 years, I was back on my push bike, coming back down the hill to the airport terminal. And that's why it's called a cyclical industry, because you always end up on a bloody bicycle at the end of the day. We've actually faced some, I'm so glad I paid Brad to laugh. He's got such a deep voice there, it really made. We've faced a lot of big issues over the last 2 days, and I think we've faced them pretty transparently as a community. Now, or a family, I'd say probably more like a family with a couple of cousins you don't particularly like. But there are 4 things I think we've got to knock on the head just now as we end this conference before we manage to run up Louisa's barbell one last time. Here are my 4 thoughts that I think are very important for us to take away, and better than that, take away and act on. This is a very hard fact. There are many assets will never fly profitably again. The corollary of that is that there are actually some assets that will never fly again. So if you own one of them, wake up, look in the shaving mirror in the morning and say that is a piece of junk. Write it down, burn it, sell it, give it away, but just act on it. Don't bring it out and pretend that you can actually service a contract with it. The second thing to take away is that offshore gets a big slap about. But remember, as Steve said, there's a big difference between production, which is a stable, steady, it's got its problems, it's got efficiencies, it's got other things. It's a steady state, long-term project. Just as we saw, exploration and development is fugitive. But don't think all of a sudden the EMS is this holy land where everything is great in milk and honey. Because true, if you look at the US, the 2 biggest people, the public bonds trade at junk levels. There are huge issues in the US about how people get paid. Doesn't that sound slightly familiar, boys and girls? EMS is growing in other countries, but we've seen repossessions in China and India where those prospects have been just too early to work. Helicopter business is complex, whichever sector you look at. So don't automatically think you can jump from one to the other and have a risk-free ride. There are no risk-free transactions. All you're doing is you're swapping a risk you didn't like for a risk you haven't noticed. And then let's talk about scale. We heard a lot about scale. Yeah? I was going to make a fat joke, but I'm just not really going to go into that. But scale is a two-edged sword, my friends. Being too big is as bad as being too small as a lessor. Being too big is as bad as being too small as an operator. Being big rather than too small is also a problem for a bank. Just think about that putting capital to work question that came up. Just think about pushing forward the size of the book, and then think about the sort of people who are weathering the storm better. And I'm just going to name some names. I apologise to the people that I don't name. LCI and Nova, not the biggest. They're weathering well. Look at the operators. We saw Stephen Bay talking about NHV. Bit of a joke a few years ago, possibly. Now producing. Omni, another very interesting company. They didn't need to be the biggest. They didn't even need to be the biggest in their core market. They're loyal and true to their business thesis. And that comes first over scale and growth. Cash is sanity, volume is vanity. There's no point in just being the biggest so that you can lose more money faster than the other guy. It's very like the tech boom in the States all those years ago, where people had a negative margin and tried to trade out by increasing volume. For the mathematically gifted amongst you, you know that multiplying a negative number just makes a bigger negative number. And then what's the absolute joy in our industry? Do you know what it is? Okay, lots of deals are horrible. Lots of individual helicopters are horrible. Lots of people are having pain. But the deals that can be done at better returns, risk-adjusted returns, than the drillers get, than sometimes the shipping gets. Those deals are better. I would rather invest in a helicopter deal today in the offshore oil and gas sector than buy a sub-participation from a Chinese bank in an A320. That's a no-brainer. But again, as a community, what we need to do is focus on the strong parts and work towards them, while deliberately walking away from the bad parts. Now, I don't actually subscribe to we've got to have your one uniform configuration of a 139 that can fly from Greenland to the Antarctic. I think it's more complicated than that. But it's not much more complicated than that, and we can do it if we address that as a community. So in summary, a couple of years ago at this point, nobody was actually at the closing session because they'd heard so much bad news. They'd either run outside lying down in front of a bus to be run over and killed, or they were in the bar actually from last night, still getting drunk to remember how painful the first one was. Last year, people were being a bit more honest. You couldn't move for bankruptcy advisors, which was very interesting. Now they're, of course, all in Florida or the Cayman Islands, sunning themselves. So it's up to us in this room to make a difference to our industry. It doesn't matter if you're an investor, a funder, a broker, an appraiser, an accountant, an operator, or a lessor. This is a mission-critical business. The assets we invest in, we should buy wisely and use for a long time. But we should also maintain discipline. And that discipline runs all the way from not going to Chevron and say, I'll give you an S92 for nothing, to a lessor saying, I've got a banking covenant, I've got to get that on at any price, and doing a short-term easy lease. Those sort of things maybe were necessary right at the pit of the crisis, but now we have to have united discipline and respect that each person in that life ladder I talked about deserves a fair cut, because that's what capitalism is about, leaving enough on the other man's table to take home. Because otherwise, people will just pack up and go. And if they pack up and go, the toilets on the production rigs are going to be full within a week. And that's not going to be a very pretty sight. So ladies and gentlemen, think of what we've learned over these productions, these presentations and panels over the last 2 days, and take good heart. Because I'm not being foolishly optimistic. I was foolishly optimistic when I invested all my money in Royal Bank of Scotland shares. That was silly. I'm not making that mistake again because I'm self-employed, so I've got no shares. But you're claiming, yeah, I'll sell you some, Crispin, if you want, or anybody who's up for it. Very good. But the serious point is this. We are past the worst. There is still pain to be taken, and that is principally from the 2 or 3 very large people in some sides who have not taken their pain. Now, there are write-offs in, how can I put this politely? Lessors lag the operators in terms of taking the pain, and there's a couple of big guys who need to settle down and just face reality. Let's get that over with, let's get on, let's work together, keeping people on and off the oil rigs, rescuing and transferring patients, fighting fires, or even air taxi if that's your thing. But let's do it, ladies and gentlemen, with a long-term view, because this is a long-term asset and it deserves the respect of a long-term view. Thank you. I'll happily take any questions, criticisms. Actually, I'll take money as well, if that's it. Jean-Marc. Jean-Marc does not need a microphone.
Well, that was an excellent speech. Absolutely brilliant. Several years ago, during the helicopter lessor, our good friend the lessor and everybody here who lead the industry said, well, it's carnage, we need assistance. We need to get together. When? How? We, all of us here, have the solution to every single problem that is presented in front of us, because we all have an expertise in one way or the other. So I'm just asking you and everybody else here, when are we going to do it?
I will leave that festering in your minds. I'd suggest sooner rather than later.